Okay, I believe we'll get started now with the webinar. Again, my name is Abhinav Praneeth, and I'll be your host for this uh, session. And let me go ahead and share the agenda for today. So I'll start with a quick introduction of myself and our speaker Randall, followed by a quick word from the sponsor, which is the Farman from Digitech. Of course, the main feature would be Randall presenting his thoughts, essentially the objective of this webinar, which is to become familiar with how to implement LeanNow or any Lean for that matter in non-manufacturing organization. And lastly, it will be followed with about 10 minutes of question and answers, open Q&A, and a word about that on our next slide. Some housekeeping around Q&A. You are welcome to post your questions via Q&A box, which you would find in the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. Please go ahead and enter your question in Q&A box as we go along in the presentation. Questions will be grouped essentially by the topic covered in the webinar. And finally, one of the important things is that this webinar is being recorded, and the slides and this recording will be made available after the meeting, usually in a day or two, and will be shared with the participants via the registered team. So let's go ahead and start with the introductions. Our speaker for today is Randall Benson, who's CEO of Benson Consulting and authority on LeanNow. And myself, I'm Abhinav Praneeth. I'm a senior solution architect with Digit Incorporate here in Copenhagen. So a word about Randall, if he likes to call himself self-confessed lean heretic. More about that in Randall's own words. He's a lean consultant, coach, and a trainer, and has been part of the industry for quite a few years now. He's also the author of The Quest Effect, which is a book that is being read and used by organizations that are looking for drastic strategic changes and implementing principles to improve their processes. Randall has worked with manufacturing, distribution, healthcare, etc., different industries over a period of time, and he's based in Seattle area. And more from Randall when I hand over the presentation. A quick word from our sponsor, which is Supplier from Digitech. Digitech Incorporate, we are a pioneer in web-based collaborative products and solutions, primarily targeted for geographically distributed teams. Since about 2002, we are headquartered in Cupertino, California. We have close to about 300,000 users across the geography, which would include the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific, again in different industries and different verticals. The products that Digitech covers would cover your Lean Kanban, your Agile application lifecycle management, and the space of project, program, and portfolio management. And lastly, Swift Kanban is our flagship Lean Kanban product, and a quick word about that in the next few slides. So Swift Kanban is your visual management tool for software development, and can be applied to pretty much any industry. The idea here is to give a visual display of the work that has been undertaken by the organization in different projects, and give a complete overview at a glance in terms of what work is going on and who's responsible and where in the life cycle or in the process flow is the work currently existing. So what you can see on your screen is a slide that depicts that based on different types of work that you identify, typical work items or work categories being issues, user stories, defects, tasks associated with the project, wherein in your process flow or value stream they lie. The Kanban board is a good indicator, visual representation for that. And depending on the type of work that you're doing, you can create a board specific to that. Tracking deliverables, for example, as shown in this scheme, all your work items can be grouped based on where they lie in the life cycle and based on the type of work that you are doing. It can be marketing, it can be development, it can be quality assurance. Different departments within an organization can carry out the types of work and use Kanban visualization. Here's an example of Thanksgiving, which is coming up in less than a month here in US. So a variation of personal Kanban, which you can utilize, be it your daily chores or any activity at a personal level, repairs, constructions, whatever you feel like. You can put it on Kanban board and see where your different tasks and elements of your work are progressing across the board. Quick word about the Lean Agile stack. As you can see from the layers, there's this visualization layer, which is of course the key to the Kanban board and the dashboard for the metrics, and then you've got different rules layered underneath, and then it supports a variety of platforms, and one of the highlights being the ability to integrate with different systems and be part of an ecosystem wherein your other systems can talk to Swift Kanban and operate jointly. All right, so that was a quick word about Swift Kanban. Moving on, just a key customers across the globe in different geographies. And with that, we hand it over to Randall to walk us through his presentation and understand LeanNow features. Randall, over to you.
Well, if I just bring up my presentation here. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so happy that you're here. Today, I'd like to talk about getting started with LeanNow or any Lean application that you're planning for a non-manufacturing type organization. Our challenge with LeanNow was to make it fast and easy as an approach to Lean implementation, because my Lean Heretic side says that applying the traditional manufacturing model that was developed over 50 years ago on the shop floor of Toyota really doesn't work anymore for most non-manufacturing organizations. And in most of the industrialized world, that means about 90% of those of us that work in industry probably don't work on the shop floor. And so what we've tried to do is develop a product that works for those type of organizations. So today's topics are really a recap, just a quick recap of what LeanNow is for those of you who might not have been at the first webinar. And then I want to talk about kind of what you do before you start into a LeanNow type implementation, and then address the 5 kind of simple steps to do LeanNow, and then talk a bit about follow-up assessments and driving results over time. So this is a new webinar for us, so if my pacing is too slow or you think I'm not doing enough detail, just type it in the lower left-hand corner, and I'm sure I'll get reminded to adjust my pace. So this webinar is really designed for people who are on a Lean journey. That could be executives, managers, program leaders, people on the Lean team that are working specifically in non-manufacturing organizations. This may apply in a manufacturing organization, but I can't guarantee it, because the things we've done to make LeanNow different than other types of Lean approaches is to design it so it addresses particular lean attributes in service organizations, and also tries to stop doing things that were made for manufacturing organizations that lean doesn't have to do if it's in a non-manufacturing environment. So if you're in a service, healthcare, high-tech, nonprofit, government, education, non-governmental organization, those types of organizations, then this workshop ought to be for you. And of course, I'm going to be addressing people like yourselves who are considering doing lean in the planning process, doing it now, or expanding their lean program to other parts of their business. And so today I'd like to talk about getting started and also maybe helping you select an approach to lean. This one will be different than other approaches you might have heard about. And so hopefully it'll give you some other ways to think about how to get started with lean. So my definition of lean is a little bit different than the traditional industry standard definition, because I start with creating and sustaining an uninterrupted flow of value to the customer. So the idea of flow comes first for me, and then in support of flow, I add by involving everyone in the elimination of any waste that impedes that flow, and ultimately all waste in every form in the organization. So the traditional definition of lean is more like involving everyone in the organization in the elimination of waste in every form. But I found that that emphasis on waste actually created a misdirection for organizations. And so we've taken a flow-first approach and attempt to get organizations to implement flow immediately within 30 days of getting started, and then using that flow as a tool to identify and eliminate waste as we go forward. The idea of Lean Now, as we've been working on it, is to create a visual management system that was purpose-built for non-manufacturers, and that has that flow-first approach. So we start by implementing flow and then do waste reduction and workplace organization and those types of things after flow's in place. And our goal is to get from 0 to being able to manage with lean principles in 30 days and to be getting bottom line results for your organization within 30 days after that. So we think we can build a faster, less expensive, more effective approach to lean by taking the flow-first approach. So when I say doing lean, I'm talking about two things. I'm talking about managing your daily operations with lean principles and also improving continuously the flow. So just putting it in place is not enough. You have to also be improving it. A lot of organizations take literally years to get to the point where they're actually managing daily operations with lean principles. So what we wanted to do is kind of put the cart before the horse, or put the cart after the horse, I should say, and start with flow, and then be able to do the use flow to focus on the other parts of lean implementation. So before you get started with a lean implementation, there's probably a few things you should think about. One of them is, have you built a strong business case for doing lean? So a business case is different than just looking at improvements like flow time or turnaround time, customer service, things like that lean, of course, provides, but actually looking at things that affect the financials of your organization. So do you know how lean will increase sales, generate cash faster, create more earnings for your organization, or surplus if you're a nonprofit organization, expend less capital and reduce risk, and you may have other considerations as well. Now, I'm not suggesting this because I think that otherwise you won't be able to justify lean. It's kind of the opposite. What I found is that organizations are really not recognizing the total value of lean to the organization, so they don't put enough resources against it because they're not really tracing the benefits out to the bottom line of the organization. So we think that if an organization can get bottom line results that affect these kinds of measures within 60 days, then it will change their kind of approach to implementing lean. The other thing is making sure that you have the resources that you need to get started with lean. Again, we're trying to make lean easy and make it fast and make it effective, so we don't require nearly as much resources, maybe 10% of the resources that a traditional lean implementation would take. Even so, it requires some resources that have to be put in place. So do you have the staff time set aside so that you can actually spend the time learning and applying lean principles. Do you have consulting support if you need it to help implement lean? In the case of the approach we take, we use a virtual Kanban board, so that requires that an organization obtain virtual Kanban seats for everybody in their organization that will be part of the lean flow. And also, do you have the authority to make changes? And for those of you who want to integrate the virtual Kanban boards with other IT applications, do you have the ability to do that integration during the short time that the LeanNow implementation would happen? So just want you to make sure that you have a commitment for these resources before scheduling the kickoff. Doing lean with the LeanNow approach is really, really simple compared to what we've seen in the industry over time. I just heard a presentation last week at a government conference. It was a keynote presentation by the vice president at the most famous hospital in the United States that does lean. And she said that they spent 15 years so far doing lean, and probably the first 10 years of that, they didn't get much in the way of results. So that's what I'm trying to help organizations avoid, is putting in all that upfront work with a lot of complicated steps in order to finally get to the point where they can manage with lean principles. So we've come up with 5 what I think are really simple steps to get the lean flow and the ability to do lean management really quick. So we start with helping the organization understand the lean principles that they'll need to know to do lean management on a daily basis. To pick a value stream and map that value stream so they know what the processes are, the key processes in that flow. To build the virtual flow on a Kanban board, and either a virtual Kanban board or sometimes people use physical ones in their area, either way, and then set the queue limit so that we can set up for pull. And then finally, not finally, but the next step is to implement pull and to be able to manage that flow on a daily basis with lean principles. Then improve that flow by eliminating waste to streamline the flow itself. So that's basically the parts of implementing LeanNow. And what I thought I'd do is just step you through some of the principles here, or some of the steps along the way. So first is understanding the principles. Lean teams can't be effective until they understand the basic principles of lean management. So we want to help them do that, and by understanding the principles, we also mean those principles that apply specifically to non-manufacturing organizations that may not be discussed in a traditional manufacturing type implementation. That doesn't mean you have to send your staff off for weeks of training. It doesn't mean you have to go to Japan for factory tours. It doesn't mean you have to get your staff certified in lean, but what it does mean is playing meaningful games or learning simulations so that people can grasp these ideas very quickly in order to move on with the implementation of the lean flow itself. So what we've discovered over the years, and I've been doing this for more than 20 years, is that simulation is more effective by an order of magnitude than classroom training. So we try to start off every LeanNow implementation with classroom training. So we use a half a day of lean simulation that creates the intended ahas that we need for organizations to grasp in order to implement the LeanNow process. And then those realizations are very difficult to do in the classroom training or on tours. But we found that we can do them reliably in a half a day using a simulation model. So we use a simple service delivery game. It has simple work pieces and processes. It goes through 4 phases. We keep score during the game. We debrief after each phase and after the game. And we try to create a dramatic transformation that the people in the organization can live through during that half-a-day implementation. So here's a client in a conference room going through this conference room simulation. The inset there is the scoreboard that they were actually keeping during the game. So you can see the 4 phases in the game on the scoreboard. And these people will spend about 4 hours going through this and learning how to make that paper process that you see there flow in a lean manner, and understand how to manage it and how to transfer those ideas into their own area. So starting with this type of approach can save you a lot of time, but if you have other ways to do training. And you could start with traditional training as long as you cover the same topics that we'd be covering in the lean approach. In the simulation approach. The simulation scoreboard looks kind of like this. Now I've just taken phase 1 and phase 2. I've left phase 1 and phase 4. I've left phase 2 and 3 off. But you can see some of the dramatic improvements. I mean, throughput time was reduced by 7-fold, rush times cut in half, work in process was cut 9-fold, productivity skyrocketed, customer backlog dropped by about 75%. And I really love the last one. The effort, while producing this incredible jump in productivity and throughput, the effort goes from high in the beginning of the simulation to very low at the end. So the people in the simulation are saying that they can produce more faster with much lower effort at the same time. So this isn't just a hurry up and work faster model. It's actually a way to create some serenity in the organization while the product is being delivered or the service is being delivered. So what we need to do during the simulation is demonstrate some of the key lean principles that we'll draw on later in the next 30 days. And so I won't read through all of these, but here are some of the kinds of things that we try to cover and talk about during that 4 hours of simulation. And it's amazing how many of the principles we can demonstrate and have people actually work through and experience themselves during the short period of the simulation. Once we complete the simulation in the morning, we spend part of the afternoon applying the ideas from the simulation to the organization's own business processes. And so what we're looking for here is the ability to map from the metaphors in the game to the actual work. And sometimes the metaphors are simple and sometimes they're more complicated. When they're simple, the solution might be patently obvious. I remember one vice president of a savings and loan bank going through the game and saying, I want to do that now. And he meant like the next week. And so he wanted to apply it to loan processing, and the simulation was so close to loan processing that they could basically see exactly how they could do it simply by going through the game. Others need a little bit more time to explore how it would fit in their organization. For example, I just finished working with a client to apply this process to their IT and trouble ticket systems, IT development and trouble ticket systems. And so they think a little bit more about how this was different than Agile and where it might work and how they would apply a lean approach in their organization. The game often becomes a touchstone, and it's referred to in the next few weeks as the organization goes through the process of creating flow. So it's really important that they experience the game if they're going to be working on the project later, so they can be part of that understanding of what happened in the game and the touchstone effect. We're now designing an online version of this simulation that can be played from anywhere, and I'm looking forward to having that available in the weeks to come. So step 2, that takes about a day to get through that step. Step 2 is to pick a value stream and map it. And organizations are full of value streams, so it's a matter of which ones would be the most interesting to begin with in terms of applying the LeanNow model. So a value stream is a process flow required to bring a product or service to the customer. So it's a flow of value from the beginning of the process, hopefully, to actually creating customer value. And you can see some of the examples here: emergency room visits. I work with a client that resolves illegal dumping complaints, loan processing I mentioned, handling customer inquiries, onboarding a new customer. Those would be examples of value streams. Some organizations choose not to use value streams, but to apply more to core processes, which tend to be internal processes in their organizations, processes that must be performed perfectly or in a close to perfect manner in order to ensure that the firm continues to be competitive. So those would be things like recruiting and hiring talent, getting paid after delivering products or services, disposing of obsolete assets, etc. So we encourage organizations to start with a value stream because it's easier to get customer results if you're using a value stream, and it's easier to get results to drop to the bottom line. But some organizations have such trouble in core processes, like work with a client where recruiting and hiring and onboarding talent was the biggest problem in their organization. So we started there as opposed with as opposed to a value stream itself. So after we've identified the value stream, and that can take a while to determine which value stream is the most amenable to the LeanNow approach and which ones would make the most sense to start first. But once we've identified that value stream, then the next step is to create some kind of a map of the value stream. So a map is like a blueprint for a builder. We need this map of the processes in the value stream so we understand how it works and how we can place it onto a Kanban board or some other type of pull system in the organization. So here we've used traditional value stream mapping software to create this picture of a value stream. One value stream is on a map at one time. You'll see that there's these lines across the page that create zones. So the bottom zone is for timing, and the middle zone is for the processes, and the top zone is kind of for the meta processes and control systems. And of course, the top is the name of the value stream. We like to add another line across here for working with high contact service organizations. That's called the line of visibility. So we actually separate those processes that have customer visibility from the ones that the customer can't see, because the processes that the customer can see need to have a marketing overlay to them. We need to understand where the customer contact is in the flow in order to have it work well. So that's one of the significant differences between a factory model and a service organization model, for example. Supplier input, usually the supplier is the customer, but it could be an upstream user in your organization. Our upstream provider, the end of the value stream hopefully is the customer, but it could be an end user internally in your organization. Then we have a map of the key processes, usually lined up in a serial fashion. We collect some data about those processes. We identify the kind of flow that we want from one process to another. Usually that's a first in, first out pull system type model, but sometimes we use other types of flows when we have to. We identify the existing queues or work in process, what's in the in basket between the steps in the process. We identify the air traffic control systems, the coordinating systems, if there are any, that coordinate the flow of value through this value stream, what the communication patterns are, the communication requirements, and across the bottom we have this timeline. It keeps track of the cumulative time to get 1 unit of work or 1 unit of value from one end of the value stream to the other. It's sawtooth because in this case, the upside of the sawtooth is the actual time on task, and the downside of the bottom part of the sawtooth is the queue time in between the tasks. That queue time will usually be between 10 and 20 times the amount of time on task that we see in a flow. So that's the idea of creating a value stream and mapping the value stream. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about how we actually turn that into flow in the organization. So in order to depict flow without having to reorganize the workplace and eliminate a lot of waste up front, which is what we don't want to do, we found that the easy way to do it is to borrow a tool from IT software development, the virtual Kanban board. In this case, we're showing an example using the Swift Kanban product. And to use this to depict the flow in the non-manufacturing organization, instead of trying to go dig all the files out of wherever they may be and create and do all the things factories have to do to create flow. So we've basically done an end run on all those front-end processes by simply using the virtual Kanban board to represent our flow here. So again, like the value stream map, we start out with one Kanban board per value stream. Each column represents a process, like the process symbols on the value stream map. Each card represents a work piece that will need to be delivered to the customer eventually, or some type of work piece is literal, sounds physical, but it could be just any unit of work. The flow goes from the left side of the board, from the ready column to the finished column on the other side. You don't see that here because this Kanban board actually has 18 columns on it if you saw the whole thing, so I just borrowed a piece of it here. There's a working area of the Kanban board, which tends to be at the upper half of the Kanban board, and then there's a ready to pull area below that, which says that that work is done and is now ready to be pulled to the next area. and we'll talk more about pull systems here in a minute. This card that I just highlighted is blocked. That means it can't be pulled to the next area. It can't be completed, so that's something that somebody should pay attention to. Here's one where the number of cards in the sub-column has been exceeded, and it's turned that area red, which tells us that that's going to be a blocking process here in a short amount of time unless we fix the problem. So that's the idea of the virtual Kanban board, and that's kind of like the heart and soul of the LeanNow management system, is to use these boards to track our flow. And they have a huge advantage, many advantages over physical Kanban approaches, but I've certainly worked with clients to create physical Kanban approaches. If everybody's in the same organization and they're co-located and their work pieces are kind of file-like or physical things that we can see, then it is possible to do it, but you give up a lot of capability when you use a physical approach as opposed to an approach that uses electronic Kanban boards. So now what we want to do is start with boards and columns when we construct the physical, not the physical, but the virtual Kanban board. So we use our value stream map to identify the board. So basically we have one Kanban board per value stream map, and then the processes become the Kanban board columns. So typically, if we built the value stream map carefully, each of those processes will be a column on the Kanban board. So there's a really easy, building the value stream map makes it really easy to build the Kanban board after that. Here is an example of a Kanban card, kind of blown up. So this is what's inside the Kanban card, and kind of a lot of detail to go through, but I want to touch on a few highlights here. This card is the kind of the heart of the LeanNow management system. It represents some unit of work that's flowing through the organization, through the value stream in the organization. And it represents probably a unit of work that's deliverable to the end user, to the customer. There's a lot of detail on the Kanban board. We know which employee is working on the card at the moment. We have a description. In this case, this was one from my client that was handling illegal dumping complaints in a government agency. So I removed some of the data, but basically has a little bit of information about the dumping complaint itself. There's a menu of things I can put in that comments area, so I can attach pictures. I can link out to internet sites. I can do other kinds of things here to make that description area really meaningful for the organization. Across the bottom, we have key attributes that we're going to want to use, like the priority of this card. If it had a due date that was critical, we might put the due date in. However, we tend not to want to work with due dates. It gets in the way of flow, but if we need due dates, we can note them down there. We can estimate the amount of work this card represents, the class of service. So is this an expedite class or a standard class, or is there something special about the way this card must flow? If so, we can note it in the class of service. Again, the size this is a medium-sized card, and we have other attributes we can use as well. Now, this is just one view of the card. If you look across the top, I can also add comments to the card that other people can see. I can put actual checklist to-dos in this card, which is very useful if this is a recurring process that I'm going to use a card like this over and over again. I can add more extensive attachments to the card. I can have an activity log. Some of the things that aren't shown on here is I can use this as a communication device, so I can actually be talking to other people who are working on the same piece of work as I am by putting comments in, sharing them via this card. So this is a critical piece, and think about how much more information and control you have here compared to putting a Post-it note on a whiteboard in a traditional physical Kanban board situation. So this has gone so far beyond the traditional physical Kanban board that even for co-located clients where their staff are co-located, I still recommend this Kanban, virtual Kanban approach as opposed to the physical one. Once we have the cards created and we have the board in columns, the next thing we want to do is create queue limits, sometimes called Kanban limits or column limits. They all mean the same thing, but basically what we want to do is we want to set the maximum number of cards that can be in any of the columns on the Kanban board. So here's a column that says write the letter and or close the complaint. There's maximum of 15 in that column that we can have. So that means that given that I have 4 in that column right now in the working area, I'm in good shape. So that this column is probably not blocking flow at this point. One really cool feature of the Swift Kanban product is we can also have subcolumns and sublimits. So for the working column, I can have like a limit of 6, and for the whole column, I can have a limit of 15. There's actually 3 areas in this column. One is working, one is ready to pull, and one is waiting for a response from the complainant. So the total of that can't exceed 15, but I can also create a blocking, or I can create limits within that 15 for different parts of the column, which is very useful in the Lean setting. So really like that feature. So how do we set queue limits? This is one thing that in implementation conversations often comes up, and there's a lot of different opinions about this. In theory, the queue limits are based on the variation in the cycle times between the 2 processes where the queue is, and how much those cycle times vary determines how much queue we're going to be drawing down over time. And so the more variation we have, the more queue we need, and the higher the limit we need. Well, that's good in theory. It's very hard to calculate that. And so what we generally do is start with an informed estimate. And the way we get the estimate is we ask ourselves, what limit would be just high enough so you very, very rarely run out of work between these two processes. That's probably just about the place you want to start out for setting your Kanban limit. And so if there's queue there, if we set the limit too high, then some of that queue will never be used, basically. We'll never get down to it. And what that means is that's basically waste. That was overproduction we want to get rid of. So we want that queue just high enough so we almost run out of work, but never quite run out of work. And that's about the right level. So generally we say, guess at what the, use an informed guess at what the queue limit should be, and then watch it for 2 to 4 weeks after setting the board up, adjusting the queue limit as you go, as you understand more about how the processes work. And then when you get close, after about 2 to 4 weeks, then set the queue limits as a standard, and then use process improvement to adjust those queue limits from that point forward. One thing that a lot of clients get wrong is they think that when their volume increases, they should increase the queue limits. And the queue limits do not depend on volume, because cycle times do not depend on volume. The only thing that it depends on is the variation in cycle times. So we don't want to raise the queue limits just because our volume goes up. And so I often have to remind my clients of that. We also want to make the pull status visible. So what we need here is several things. First, in the area in red there, that's the working area at the top of the Kanban board that I showed a minute ago. So that helps us to know that those cards are actually in process, being maybe on somebody's desk or being worked on by somebody. Maybe they have them in the field, or they have a record on a computer that they have their name on that they're working on. The bottom area are pieces of work that have been completed, and we move those down there so that the people over in the next column, if it's a different person, know that those are available to pull as they have capacity into the next column over on the board. So that's the ready to pull area. So that gives us a lot of visible status, just knowing what's being worked on and what's ready to be pulled to the next area. The other thing you'll note here is the block card. That block card can't be moved either to the next column or down to the ready to pull area. So somebody will want to unblock that card as fast as possible. We have a way to show that that card is not in the status to be pulled to the next step in the process. So when we get the board set up at this point, now we're able to actually self-manage the flow. So it doesn't really require any supervisor or manager intervention to run this board and to create the process flow, other than to unblock that card that's stuck right now. That would be the kind of thing where we'd want want to have a manager intervene. Some other possible pull statuses that I see clients use occasionally, some have like a ready to close area. So like in the complaint process, the complaint could be closed at any point along the way. So we have a ready to close area, which means it's not going to the next step, but it's actually going to be taken out of the system early because the complainant gave up or the person who was being complained against complied, and we're done. We don't have to go to the final step. Another thing I see sometimes is waiting for some external response, where we're waiting for the organizations are waiting for their customer or supplier to get back to them with some information. And so sometimes we have a category for waiting for external response. So just those things that make it very clear what work is ready to be pulled to the next part of the system or the next step in the process. There's a process a lot of us have heard about in the Toyota factories. The and-on system is oftentimes considered like a pull chain in on a locomotive, where you can pull the chain and stop the locomotive. So basically stop the line by pulling this handle. And we need similar types of signals, and-on signals, alarm signals, in our organizations in order to make sure that Lean continues to work effectively after we set the flow up. So here's an example of a couple signals. One is that block card that we saw earlier, and another point here in the flow, we see that the limit's been exceeded in a subcolumn. So both of those are signals that are kind of like, you can imagine as a flashing light in your organization that should be attracting the attention of supervision. In Toyota, they're famous for having executives and managers run across the shop floor when one of those lights goes off in order to see if they can help the operator get their process running again. So it's kind of the same thing for virtual Kanban boards too. We want to be able to use these as signals to attract the attention of management and get management support to help get the process going again. So block cards, exceeded queue limits are ones we want to be looking for. Sometimes empty columns are a problem, depends on how your process works. Sometimes too many days on the board, otherwise a slow-moving card can cause a flag to go up. And sometimes exceeding a time limit for an external reply. So you're waiting for your customer to get back to you, but after a point and they haven't gotten back, that may cause an alarm to go off or a signal to show on the board. So those are the kinds of things we'd be looking for. And again, when a signal goes off or an alarm goes off, we'd expect management to respond immediately to that. If management doesn't respond, then pretty soon those air conditions, those signals become the new normal, and they'll be ignored, and it won't be long before the process flow will start to deteriorate, and the flow will be jammed by these stuck cards or stuck columns. Having a Kanban board is part of the work, but we also have to create a place to put our backlog. In traditional non-Lean organizations, all the backlog goes into current work in process. But in a Lean model where we've got limits on those columns, it isn't feasible to put all that to put backlog into work in process. In fact, we definitely do not want that to happen. We want to hold any work that can't go on the board at the beginning of the process, and that's the job of the backlog board, is to keep that work at that point. And then only release this work when it's ready to go onto the board. This is usually a management job. And this is also where we prioritize work. So the order that work in the backlog is released to the board is the way we triage or prioritize the work that's going to flow in our organization. I highly recommend that once the work is triaged from the backlog to the board, that it not be re-triaged column by column after that. That's often called cherry picking. So when you go to the ready to pull section, using a first in, first out model there is very useful, as opposed to having the person in the next column simply pick the piece of work they'd like to work on the most. So only prioritize once, and that's when you move the work from the backlog to the board itself. Hopefully the work, because it's now a Lean flow, will move so quickly across the actual value stream once it started that it won't have to be reprioritized. There won't be any need to reprioritize it again. So the cards from the backlog then move to the ready column on the Kanban board. And if you don't have backlog, of course, you can put them directly into the ready column But most organizations from time to time have backlog, and they also want the ability to prioritize. And so prioritizing in the backlog before it's put on the board is the easiest place to do that. But the idea is to move from the backlog to the Kanban board when the work is actually ready to start. So the next step is to actually create the flow and manage the flow in the organization. So this means implementing pull and using the pull system to manage the flow. And this is the point when we're ready to do Lean on a daily basis in our organization. So when you get to this point, you basically can say that you're now doing Lean, you're being Lean because you're able to manage workflow with Lean principles. So we think you can get to this point easily within 30 days and not the months and years that have been required with traditional approaches. So let's look at a couple of the key ideas that are part of the daily management system in LeanNow. First off, again, we want to start with our backlog. This is just a different view of the backlog. This is a list view as opposed to the board view, but it's the same information. We start here. Probably our customer or upstream department has given us work that dropped into our backlog. We prioritize the work, put it in the ready column on the Kanban board, and then the person or people who do the next step can pull that work from the ready column into their column and begin working the board. The work flows across the board step by step until it's gotten to the last step. And then we deliver that either to our customer or if it's a core process, possibly to our downstream user. So this is basically how we get work onto the board and move it across the board. To do this, we're going to want to use the pull system to move the cards. So we actually push the work from the backlog to the board. Once it's on the board, then the work should be pulled from that point forward all the way across the board. And the pull system is incredibly easy to use if you use a Kanban board to do it. So up at the top of the board here, again, we have our limits, and we can see that we haven't exceeded the limit in this second column, which means that whoever needs to do work in that second column can go to the first column, down to the ready to pull section, and grab the next card, the case 81 there, and pull it over to the middle section there to show that they're working on it. Now, if it's a different person doing the work in that second column, then the picture on the card should change at this point, and the card will be reassigned to the person who's now working in that second column. So we can actually tell by the picture on the card who's doing the work. Once that work is done, let's say in this case, case 94 is being completed, that case can be now moved down into the ready to pull area in that same column. It can't be pushed to the next column, but it can be just put down in the area that says, if you want it next column, you can come and get it now. I finished it, and it's waiting for you. If nobody pulls it out of that column, like let's say the process letter column isn't pulling work forward, then eventually that work that's in the ready to pull area will count against our column limit, our Kanban limit, and we'll have to stop doing work, stop pulling work into this column. So you can see that as if something's wrong on the board and the work starts to back up, it creates a crisis right away. And that's exactly what we want to do, is create an immediate small crisis that says, there's something wrong today on this board, rather than wait until we have 6 months or more of backlog in our whole system where we've just been pouring work in process into a system that isn't working and only finding out long after it's too late that we have way too much backlog and we're not meeting customer expectations any longer. So this is a system that produces a small, urgent crisis quickly if there's a problem with the flow on these Kanban boards. Okay, so the guy processing letters can now come over and grab case, actually they should have grabbed case 70, I guess, but case 73 in this case, and pulled it over to the next column and start working on that. By the way, the person might have grabbed case 73 because they don't have the qualifications to do case 70, but had the qualifications to do 73. So while we don't recommend cherry picking the ready to pull column, we do recommend that people work to their highest capability, but not above their highest capability unless they're working with somebody else on a learning basis. So case 70 may have been above their skill level at this point. All right, so now we can pull these cards across the board We also want the ability to respond to these alarm signals. So we've talked about the alarm signals quite a bit already. Here's 2 block cards and a block column. What we need to do is respond immediately to those and get them unblocked quickly, because the way that Kanban boards work, blocking cards can lead to block columns. Block columns can lead to the backing up and blocking of earlier steps in the flow very quickly, which is a good thing, but it also means that management has to get there and resolve issues quickly. So we want to work to resolve the problems with temporary workarounds frequently, and then maybe these will be candidates for ongoing process improvement down the road, but certainly get the flow working as fast as we can, and never let these signals become the new normal because we simply didn't respond to them. Other signals you might see that you could put in these boards would be like a total line stoppage, where somebody shuts down the whole board because they see a quality problem. Or we talked about external waiting and empty columns. And some organizations might be releasing to sound alarms as well. And you may have other ones that are particular to your organization. So that's the idea of responding to these signals. And this is how the board remains mostly self-managing, because the employees can pull this work forward and manage their own work and their own workflow without any intervention, unless one of these alarm signals goes off. So then what do managers do? Well, we need to change what managers do in the LeanNow model, because usually they've spent most of their time fighting fires and dealing with, kind of one-up issues before the Lean process was put in place. So now the managers are going to want to be releasing backlog, establishing the queue limits with the help of their staff, assisting when the alarm signals go off, supporting improvement projects. That's a huge part of their responsibility. Helping the team get what it needs, carrying water for the team, no matter what that is. So really being in that servant role of finding out what the team needs to keep the flow going. Rebalancing the flow as improvements are made, and maybe the original flow now has too many people in some areas. Their job is to shuffle the staff around to rebalance the flow. Also, they may be rebalancing temporarily to fix a temporary problem. Tracking metrics for the value stream, reinforcing the fact that there's standard work and that we all follow standard work in the organization with regard to the Lean process of that value stream, and also honoring self-directed work, not stepping in and stepping on and micromanaging the process, but letting the employees make the Kanban flow work. So tracking key metrics is part of this job. There's a lot of metrics. There's too many metrics that you can track. Here's some common ones that I just thought I'd put up here. I'm not going to read through them all. But usually we start by monitoring flow and level type metrics. Maybe a couple from each of those would be effective. A couple of things that I might mention. There's like customer cycle time, often called TAC time. Is something that for some reason my clients typically are reluctant to measure. This is the time between arrival of a customer requirement into your process, otherwise into your backlog or possibly onto the ready column of your Kanban board. So if we know how the time between arrivals, and we know the time between outputs, which is our total cycle time, then we can tell if our system has enough capacity overall to meet customer requirements. If we don't have capacity, then reprioritizing is going to be a fruitless process. Same thing with level. We'd like to know how much work in process and what our backlog and what the individual queues are. Especially at the beginning, I recommend you track the queues between each process, because that will help you. If you do that over a few weeks, it'll help you know what to set those Kanban limits at, because if you're not using all your queue, then you know your limit will be too high. So you can set, if you know the day-to-day queue levels, you can start to understand where to set the queue limits. I don't recommend much in the way of quality metrics the first few months, but if you're looking at them, I really like first pass acceptance. How many of the work pieces got to the next stage on the first try without having to be reworked. This is particularly useful when you're looking at problematic input, which most service organizations have, where they're not getting complete information on whatever it is that kicks off their work. rolled yield is simply adding up the first pass acceptance to see, you know, of what started, what gets all the way from one end to the other without ever having to be reworked. So that's kind of fun to watch. And productivity, you know, output per FTE is the simplest one. Some people like, because space can be really important, output per square foot sometimes is helpful there. So just some ideas about lean metrics. The problem is most organizations try to collect too many metrics. So try to keep your metrics as few as possible, concentrating on flow and level metrics for the beginning of your implementation. Adding the other ones in later if they would help. But also try to avoid putting financial metrics on the process. I had one client that wanted to know the ROI of every single ticket or card that was completed. Some people want to know what the revenue is of every piece of work that's completed, but that doesn't tend to be motivating for frontline employees. They're much more interested in the actual operational performance improvements. Okay, let's talk a little bit about eliminating waste. So now I'm assuming that you've got flow going, and now the question is, how do we eliminate waste quickly? So the cool thing is that the waste actually blocks the flow. So if we see where the flow is blocked, we can easily identify the kinds of things that need to be worked on. So here's some examples here you can read across of things that are could be blocking this flow. So we can look at the most important ones, the most significant things that are impediments to flow, and those become the opportunities for improvement. I really recommend the Plan, Do, Check, Act improvement model. I think it's very powerful, proven over a lot of years, and works very well in service in other non-manufacturing organizations. I often suggest that people use a worksheet when they're doing Plan, Do, Check, Act. Here's a typical A3 type of Plan, Do, Check, Act model that some of my clients use to help guide them through this. But it's not necessary. A lot of people can do Plan, Do, Check, Act in a matter of a few minutes, and these forms only get in their way. Sometimes people want to use Kanban boards. Like now that you have Kanban boards, you can also use it in a project mode. And so here's a Kanban board that was built to follow improvement projects with the Plan, Do, Check, Act in the middle of the board. And so we just found another purpose for a Kanban board, which is to actually do process improvement. So we can streamline the flow by using the process improvements to identify where we can now lower the Kanban limit. So in this case, we'll drop it from 15 to 10. That'll speed up our flow and tighten up the linkage between the two areas. That suggests that we've reduced the variation and the covariance between those two areas, which is great. That's what we want for process improvement. As we move along and move past the initial implementation, going back and doing assessment, I think it's really important. I usually do three assessment points along the way to check and see if we're holding the gains and fixing, you know, some problems that might have come up along the way. And so those are the simple 5 steps. That's about all there is to it. At this point, you're ready you'd be doing ongoing process improvement, workplace reorganization, and the kinds of things that would have held you up front we can now do now. This might be a good place to stop for some questions and comments. Gone a little bit long here, so I'll hold it at this point.
Randall, thank you so much for that absorbing and really interesting insight into the LeanNow principles and how an organization can expect to be up and running in those simple steps. So we are really at the top of the hour, so I do have a couple of quick questions that I want to push in, and let me go ahead and select them. Randall, just touching upon the whole principle of LeanNow, which you have shared with us, is why didn't you start with waste removal and kind of reorganizing, you know, in the workplace and focusing on flow?
Well, it really goes back to the factory days. Waste removal was necessary in factories in order to eliminate physical barriers to flow. So, you know, a factory would have done flow first if they could have, but the waste was actually physical waste that was blocking waste. So removing, actual physical work in process, reorganizing storage and material transport, moving equipment from equipment centers, machine centers into manufacturing cells, all took tons of time and a lot of effort. So that's how we got all that at the front end of the process. But service organizations and other non-manufacturing organizations almost never have those blocking barriers. So we can move very rapidly to flow without having to worry about the physicalness of the work in process and other barriers that exist in factories.
That makes sense. That's pretty relevant with what we do in non-manufacturing organizations. And one more about the backlog board. I mean, do we really need a backlog board to keep a track of what we need to work on?
If the balance of the input and output is very tight, so that you're actually producing almost immediately or responding almost immediately to the input you're getting from your customer, you can operate without the backlog board and just have the work appear in the ready column on the Kanban board itself. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's just a sign of high synchronization with your customer and fast response. For organizations that have more variation in customer input over the weeks or months or years, or not years, but weeks or months, then the backlog board is a place to keep the overage when it can't go onto the board, and it also lets them prioritize work so they start the right things into work in process. So it can be an advantage to buffer you from your customer if you can't respond to all your customer requirements right away. What we hate to see is people just stuffing the ready column on the Kanban board with weeks and weeks and weeks of work. So I wouldn't expect that ready column to have more than a week of work in it at any one time. Everything else needs to go into the backlog.
That is a good point about the backlog. And that is about the time we have for questions. If there are any more follow-up questions, I would just share the contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll try and accommodate the responses as soon as we can. One last reminder, the slides and the recording will be available, as I said, after the webinar in a couple of days, and would be shared with the registered emails of the participants. This last slide giving our contact information for Randall as well as for Kanban. So if you have many more questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to Randall or to Digite at the respective email IDs in front of your screen. Randall, any thoughts as we close this webinar?
I just want to thank everybody for spending their morning with us, and appreciate your time and enjoyed the time to talk about the implementation of LeanNow. So thanks again, and glad to be with you.
All right. Again, thank you, Randall. Thank you for your valuable time, and thank you to the participants for attending our webinar today. And we hope to see you soon in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.